under the Trump administration. And so this is something that is quite important, you know, when we factoring in some of these dynamics, and that's why we put a question mark whether it's a break from Trump, continuity and change, because of course Biden is not Trump, but in the substance of U.S. engagement in foreign policy, it is important for African stakeholders to ask the hard questions of the United States, whether its foreign policy is aligned with some of the positions that have been adopted by the African Union. We also know that as a result of COVID-19 and of course the high death rate and impact within the United States, also with social discord around your Black Lives Matter movement within the US, and you know, all of these factors made sure that there are serious tensions within US society which act as a constraint on the Biden administration. So when you go through the report, you will find some of these tensions, you know, that are outlined over there. And what we say is that, you know, so we also ask the question, so how should African partners respond, you know, to this outreach? And of course, when we do that, we have to be aware that in as much as the US has said to African stakeholders, especially Blinken when he was in South Africa, he said, no, we do not want to pressure African partners to, you know, to sort of decide to engage Russia and China. But we also aware that, you know, through the US Senate Foreign Relations Committee Strategic Competition Act of 2021, amongst other things, it proposes millions of dollars of funding towards reports on the negative impact of China's Belt and Road Initiative projects, which forms part of a proposed 300 million US dollars countering China's influence fund. You know, so it's clear that, of course, whilst the US seeks to project a more positive image and that it's not, you know, engaging with Africa simply because of its conflict with Russia and China, it is clear that according to how also the US views its, you know, how it's put across its security interests, it's clear that remains, you know, the elephant in the room still. And so the inability to overcome this, I think, is something that African stakeholders will certainly have to be raising, both at a state level, but also amongst non-state actors in Africa. Because of course we know that when the continent is caught up in the, you know, geopolitical tensions of great powers, it does not enhance or advance Africa's strategic interests. And so these are some of the issues that African stakeholders will be identifying and will be actually engaging with the US. And so as we move forward, one of the areas that Africans will also be asking of the US and will be putting on the table is to saying, to what extent is the US Africa, Sub-Saharan African strategy, will it enhance, for instance, Africa's ability to build regional value chains, to enhance its industries? You know, we've seen obviously through things like the COVID-19, how the Biden administration sort of shifted in its stance, let's say, to the Trump administration when it came to India and South Africa's position on intellectual property rights. You know, so these are issues that Africans will be putting to the table to the United States. And it is important that indeed this summit that is coming up in one way acts as a platform where Africans are putting their interests on the table, but are also responding proactively to the U.S. Sub-Saharan Africa strategy and also to the national security strategy. So this will be important as our leaders engage with their counterparts in the United States next week. It will also be important to understand that a fragmented continent of mostly landlocked countries will not be able to engage the United States on a more equal footing, and hence the imperative of greater regional integration and a shared pooling of sovereignty on select matters of importance is going to be important. It is indeed quite imperative for larger African economies to realize that inability to create a more autonomous continental and maritime space will diminish their own influence on the African continent, as external powers might step in to fill a void created by a lack of meaningful integration and cohesion within the continent. So the African counterparts have got to be making it very clear to US counterparts that in as much as they understand that the US may view certain countries as strategic rivals, Africa has to be what my former colleague used to say, my late colleague, a sort of zone of peace and cooperation where the engagement with international partners is one that aims to fulfill the continent's development priorities. And so enhancing the regional economic communities, supporting things like the African Continental Free Trade Area, becomes quite important. And then I think lastly, colleagues, is just from my part, lastly, it's just to say that when it comes to, so there was a position. So when it comes to some of the security issues, and some of these, of course, we understand will be quite sensitive issues to raise, but they will have to be discussed. So, there's been question marks since, for instance, the United States with Zambia agreed to open the African Command Office, in Zambia. What does that mean in a landscape where the Southern African Development Community has actually taken a position of not wanting, military bases within SADC and so forth? Of course, we understand that this is going to be a contentious issue that continues to be discussed. But I think what it's also important here is that in as much as, yes, the US, may play a sort of a role in the security landscape in Africa alongside other global powers. But the question is, can that security relationship be more of a holistic? So one that looks not just at the military lens. So you cannot only look, for instance, if you're talking about parts of Mozambique, for instance, Cabo Delgado. Yes, the military aspect may be important, but even of greater importance is the development imperative, in countries that are facing instability. And therefore, in as much as you may understand that the US will want to, raise issues of governance, of democracy, promotion, and so forth, what is also even of equal and maybe even greater importance is that you are partnering with African stakeholders in a manner that can advance the development aspirations of Africans. Because once you advance those development needs of African countries, you create an environment where there is actually greater stability. But a purely military lens of viewing some of these conflicts may have an impact in the short term, but you will not necessarily address the medium and long-term impacts. and lingering tensions that lead to some of these conflicts. So these are some of the issues that African stakeholders will be raising with the United States. They will be saying to the US, we need to move away from a securitization of development issues, and we need to adopt a holistic approach when it comes to issues of security. And therefore, what Africans will be saying is that, you know, in as much as we've heard sort of critique from the US, let's say of China in Africa, of Russia in Africa, what Africans will be saying is that in as much as, you know, we do not want to necessarily be preached to about democracy, about, you know, all of that, we want you to respect the natural evolution of state building processes within Africa. And we would like, you know, you to actually support concrete development objectives on the continent, you know, and whether it's linking Africa's infrastructure, whether it's about Africa's ports, whether these are the tangible partnerships, I think, that African stakeholders will be bringing to the table. And with that, I think, let me allow Professor Monyai to come in, because he'll also look on quite a number of different areas. I mean, there's issues of technology cooperation with Africa. There's the evolution of US diplomacy, you know, with Africa from a historical perspective to the contemporary era. There's also initiatives such as Prosper Africa, you know, that Dr. Monyai or Professor Monyai would want to necessarily touch on. So let me leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mthembu. Indeed, you have covered ground, and we also want to really give room for discussion. It's 50-page plus, and I think people have enough time to go through the report itself. I don't know if it's clear for those online. What should be my starting point? My starting point is that while we're putting together this report, what informed us is, what exactly does Africa want? I think it's the better way of looking at the any situation, not just relationship with the United States, but relationship with all other strategic partners that we have. The African Union has a strategic document, strategic partner document. In the evolution from OAU to AU, I think what we really have seen is that since 1963, with the formation of the OAU, Africa was really stuck in a narrative that is Cold War. I think the view, if you read the Lagos Plan of Action, it was very clear that Africa will, the thinking of our leaders was, Africa will never develop if it is involved in this relationship with external forces. I think what was core is colonialism, racism in the world, and the Cold War itself that Africa confronted. Endless wars were fought here on our continent. And therefore, as we discuss this report and the discussions we are having, I mean, this is a story that we know. I think we need just to set that up front. That is nothing new. We have been here before. And therefore, what are the big lessons we learned from the past? And how can we adjust good and bad lessons as we continue our relationship with all partners? So what is key within the AU strategic partnership is the thinking of a NEPAD process, the APRM process. I think what is central to that is, we need strategic partners to work with us in our quest for development. I think that's the leading desire on the African continent. And we therefore ask questions with all this relationship with powerful countries. How do we rank these powers? How do we see? When do we see that this relationship is beneficial to Africa or not? And therefore, as we look at the United States, we did not just target the United States. We use same measurements as we look at China, as we look at Japan, the European Union, Great Britain, and others who are coming. I think the focus at the moment is just US and China. But I think if we look carefully, we see there are quite a number of other players other than these two giants that are active on the African continent. Saudi Arabia, I think with the expansion of BRICS, we're going to see more. Brazil, an important country. And therefore, I think we need to be the back of our mind as we discuss the US-Africa, have this in mind, that Africa needs to look in its relationship with the United States and take key issues. What is it that Africa wants? One, I think there are quite a number of weaknesses within the AU itself. The 13th of December is approaching. I think even here, I think the focus is the ANC elective conference, but I think this meeting is equally important. We need to focus, the AU in particular, to put out a document, to put something in upfront. I think my colleague mentioned quite a number of sensitive issues that we cannot say as Africans in Washington. I think it is important for the AU to give a sense of coordination. What is it that we're looking for? And ask a number of other questions. Are these meetings going to be in Washington all the time? Why do we need to go to Washington all the time? The first one was in Washington. Is the third one going to be in Washington? What does it say about our relationship? I think we need to see equality in terms of if we are really partners. United States should and must come on the continent for these meetings. The idea of photo shoots in Washington, White House, and parading African leaders in a manner that shows that the United States is doing more with just narratives is to come to an end. I think this is not a message for Washington. It's a message for AU and our own leaders that they need to be proactive. They need to speak with one voice, and their message must not be all over the place. They go in as a group and they discuss issues that at most instances are much more bilateral than multilateral. This relationship, as put by my colleague, it's critical. United States remain #1 economy in the world, a powerful country. With all the stories about China and others, US remains the most powerful country, and therefore it is critical to Africa's development. However, there are other key areas that Africa is concerned, that the issue of looking at Africa through the lenses of security. There hasn't been any change in our own views from the Cold War to now, that the continent is seen as nothing else other than the backyard of the United States. I think that narrative, it's not just in White House, it just goes within the American elite, that it is not just government to government, but even among us as scholars, our fellow American academics, we exchange views where the idea of looking at Africa in those lenses has to come to an end. We have to have issues that are, as friends, the way we exchange has to be in an equal, sensitive, respectful, and we have issues around those issues that we tend to see disrespect in so many ways, in the manner in which we are referred to as Africans. Our issues are discussed. There's a lack of looking at Africans with their own agents. They're seen as influenced by other people. And that there's nothing that is disheartening, that makes some of us unhappy when someone thinks that you don't have a mind of your own. You don't have interest of your own. Your interests derive from other capitals. So that element has to be aired out, not just by our own governments, our own civil society, academics, to say, let's exchange ideas. We have set of interests, and let's look in areas where our interests converge with your interests, and where your interests diverge with ours. And we're going to unpack those areas of convergence of these interests and areas of divergence of our interests. And there's absolutely nothing wrong to have divergence of interests. That's the nature of international relation. And therefore, we look at the AU through the Agenda 2063. That's a guiding document that informed the writing of the report. The Agenda 2063 is very clear. The Africa that we want, it's an Africa that is integrated, infrastructure development. And when we talk about infrastructure, here we're looking at both soft and hard infrastructure. The training of our people, knowledge, hard infrastructure in terms of rail, road, air, movement of people on the continent. And I think there's so much that has been achieved on the African continent with all the weaknesses. And we look at to what extent is our relationship with the United States aiding our own agenda. And I think a number of questions that my colleague has really alluded to, we have serious issues on a few areas. One, the vaccine nationalism. Friends do not treat each other in their darkest hour, the manner in which Africans were treated throughout the COVID-19 crisis. That scenario where Western countries closed rank developed countries at the expense of the African continent. Not only were they hogging the vaccines, the limited vaccines which were there, the kind of message that we're sending, that you should not go to Africa, targeted countries, including South Africa. So it's not just a question of vaccines, it's the message and the impact of that message in terms of tourism, the service sector, a pillar of Africa's own development. And we were worried. And I think coupled with that, under the rubric of security, is the recent Senten saga, in which the United States security gives an alert from Norway without coordination with South Africa, and undermining South Africa's sovereignty, at a huge impact in terms of tourism. And I do not think friends will do such things. These are core areas. How best can Africa and the United States coordinate these key issues? How do they take out message in a way that is pro-development and sensitive to key issues? And we tend to see these issues lacking in the relationship, whether it's lack of coordination, management, or not understanding each other. There is something wrong that needs to be cleared. And I do not think it should be South Africa's own business to communicate to United States, but it should be an African issue, because what affects South Africa affects the continent. And I think if Africa speaks with one voice on issues of security and the need to better sent a message. On the question of infrastructure development, there has been some few lessons that we have learned throughout the involvement of China. Under Trump, one of the core issues that President Uhuru visit to Washington was President Trump wanting to develop a road along the Mombasa-Nairobi rail. That it's a classical example that as much as we have infrastructure development led by China, United States has space on the African continent. There are so many projects that United States can lead and play a meaningful role. However, to compete with China and develop a road alongside this rail has absolutely nothing to do with development. It's competition with China, and that needs to stop. And some of the manner in which the whole issue of development around infrastructure development, there are issues, lack of study, a clear message on issue of the so-called debt trap that need to be looked into, where we see the weaponization of access to developmental finance. And these are concerning issues that need to be addressed in a manner, given the centrality of United States within the IMF and World Bank. It is important to say United States has room, building back better has been a major issue, and we want to see tangible infrastructure development led by United States and Western powers. What we see or hear are much more rhetorics around these issues. When it comes to delivery, we really don't see anything on the ground. And therefore, I think the message should be, we want the build back better to advance Africa's regional integration. I think it has been, the last 2 years, the talk of building back better. And I think in the next 2, 3, 5 years, we need to measure to what extent has the United States delivered on its own promise in terms of building of African infrastructure. There are a number of other areas that the report touched on. I think one of it is to look in a futuristic and say, where are we going in terms of the impact of the competition between the United States and China and the impact it has on the African continent. The question of technologies, we have seen a lot of issues and visits by senior State Department officials. I think the Undersecretary visited Africa this year, if not last year, went to Angola and here. And we hear the rhetorics in very direct. Don't do business with China. These are some of the worrying issues. And the question that we ask, not just the anti-Huawei that which is out in the open, but the entire value chain when it comes to digital economy, e-commerce. This is the future in which we are going. And the concern, I think, from Africa is that where United States and China fight, it will have a negative impact on Africa's own development. Africa cannot develop in a global order that in disarray. There's no peace, there's no stability. These are the most important countries, United States and China. And beyond that, other than the geopolitics of development, is also the question of just within capitalism. I think Africa needs more competition, more US companies coming on the African continent, European companies coming on the African continent, Chinese, Japanese, and others to compete given the fact that we are 1.3 billion people. And we're not just 1.3 billion people. We are the youngest continent. We hold the future of the world economy. And therefore, I think it is worrying to see the tension between Washington and Beijing and the negative impact it has, particularly on issues of microchips, is worsening by the day. And there is a worry that it has a direct impact on pricing. And what we always say is that people in the rural areas, they're not interested in the fight between the United States and China over the issue of gadgets. They are more worried about the price. We need more competition, reduce the price of these products and ensure that Africa continue its developmental path in a world in which it does not really get to be hindered by other means of friends fighting in your backyard. So I think these are some of the issues that our leaders need to have a clear plan and respond clearly. But in the end, I think it's not, Africa needs to also develop its own when it comes. On issues of training of Africans, I think we have seen a number of Africans getting into European universities, into Chinese, Japanese, as well as United States. We are also worried in terms of the immigration policies in United States and the treatment of Africans in general. The African diaspora is one of the key elements of the AU, and the African diaspora is the 6th region declared in 2006. And I think it is in Africa's interest, and Africa has done extremely well with George Floyd killing United States. I think we saw communication coming clearly from the AU to condemn such things. So it is important that as much as the United States issues alerts and lack of democracy and measuring most of African countries, Africa itself, it's high time that needs to look deep into US domestic and start to raise some of the issues according to its own interests. And it should do that without being blamed that you're taking a cue from Moscow or you're taking a cue from Beijing. It's Africa's own interests. People of African diaspora are critical. What's happening in Haiti is critical to Africa. We cannot continue keeping quiet. Given the role of United States in Haiti, the entire Caribbean, these are some of the issues that need to be communicated among friends in a closed door, as Africa does the same with China. In closed door, after 3 years, they communicate, where the differences between Africa and China are aired, that we have concern in these areas. So I think what worries us as we were writing is that we tend not to see a clear, well-articulated view coming from our leaders as they go. How do you get to Washington without coordinating your own views, what you're going to present? So those are some of the issues. But I think in the interest of time, I'll pause here. I think more questions will come. This is an important meeting we're looking forward to, and more will be said in the second session, and if you open for dialogue.
No, excellent. Thank you very much for that. I think, colleagues, this was just, I mean, this wasn't a reading of the report. It was really extrapolating some of the key issues that come from the report. And I would like to invite, colleagues to actually read, the report, both, available electronically, but also as a physical copies. And we, obviously invite feedback, we invite critical engagement on it. As I said, this is ongoing work. It's not stopping. We know next year there's going to be the summit on democracies also that takes place. And, obviously Africans have views on these issues. And it's about expressing those views and engaging proactively rather than in a reactive manner. I think, Kenny, am I correct if we could take maybe a 5-minute break or so, like just stretching the legs? Some of the people at home, I mean, like online, they might have a baby to attend to at the back, and then, a little stretch break, come back, we resume. It's 11:22, let's say 8 minutes, so that we start sharp at 12:30. And then we'll have about an hour of just engagement, which will be facilitated by Ms. Faith Mabera. So 8 minutes, and then we're back in the room. Thank you. All right. Woo. Hello. Where's our? I think this one is better. Yeah. Okay. So this one is better. Yes, I see Professor Campbell is there. Sanusha is also online. So I think, yeah, Faith will take over and then we can go into the engagement.
Yeah, please. Hello, colleagues. I think for the people outside, maybe it's time to now convene so that we get this show on the road. What the panel? It's a bit better, eh? Yes, I have questions for you, Prof. Manya. I have questions for you. I have questions for you. Yes.
We replayed ourselves.
Okay, thank you, colleagues. Welcome back to the second session of our proceedings today. This is the panel section, so a bit more interactive. And I know we are slightly pressed for time. We only have an hour to cover quite a lot of ground. So I'll also try and run a bit of a tight ship here. So I'll give very brief introduction, just so you know who will be speaking on the panel. So we have Prof. Mwalimu Horace Campbell, who is a professor of African American Studies and Political Science at Syracuse University. Then we have Sanusha Naidu, who's a research fellow at IGD. Thank you both, because I can see you're online. Your participation and your presence is acknowledged. Then, of course, we have my eminent colleagues here, Dr. Mtembu and Prof. Manyae. So in this section, I think I'll be a moderator for the session, and I'll try and just, I have a couple of guiding questions that I hope will sort of lead us through the discussion. So immediately as a start, I think just as Dr. Mtembu and Prof. Manyae outlined in the earlier session, in light of recapturing some of the key points from the report, my starting sort of point would be that over the years, we've seen, or we've observed that the US policy towards Africa has been criticized as being siloed and lacking cohesion. But this observation seemed to have been rectified with the launch of the new US Africa strategy this year, coincidentally here in Pretoria, while US Secretary of State Blinken was on a visit at the University of Pretoria. So he was on a three-state visit across the continent. So in light of that observation and the fact that there's an argument to be made, or that particularly US policymakers are making, that they've rectified some of the shortcomings of previous US policy, my key question here, and here I would like to start with Prof. Campbell, is whether you think there has been a significant shift, particularly with this new strategy of the US Africa policy. And just to give you a bit more context why I'm raising this question to you. So we saw the policy oriented around 4 cardinal objectives. The first objective was the idea of fostering openness. The second objective was ensuring or closing the security. Actually, let me correct that. The second objective was delivering democratic and security dividends with a view to closing democratic deficits on the continent, among other aspects. The third objective was to support conservation, climate adaptation, and the just energy transition. And the fourth objective was pandemic recovery and harnessing economic opportunity. So those were the 4 key objectives around the US Africa strategy. So in light of this, do you think that there's marked difference with what we have seen before, or is it just more of the same? Over to you, Prof. Prof. Kamel, and I'd like maybe in your initial comments, try and restrict your comments to about 10 minutes to allow time for the other panelists. Thank you, please.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I think it's opportune that the Institute for Global Dialogue is hosting this discussion about the U.S. African Leaders Summit. And to answer your question, whether this is a shift, I think one of the important things about the report is that African scholars, intellectuals, and policymakers should take seriously the positions of the US government and the US corporate sector so that we can hold the United States government accountable. The important point about this US strategy for Africa is a new name for supporting the militarization of Africa and the United States Africa Command. It does not constitute a shift. So if you take at face value the shibboleths that they produce in their report about free and open societies, democracy, conserving energy, and making sure people have access to vaccines, you will see that in each of those objectives, it is the opposite of what the United States is doing. Let's take, for example, the promotion of democracy. In the case of the promotion of democracy, 90% of the leaders who will meet in Washington next week for this US African Leaders Summit are anti-democratic and do not support democratic relations in their country, especially among students, women, workers, cultural workers. What the Institute of Global Dialogue has focused on, which is important, is the question of what the US military has done in Africa from the time of the Cold War. It went through this in great detail, and it's important that we review this, not from the time of the Cold War, but in the past 20 years. Because the United States, in establishing the United States Africa Command, gave different reasons for the establishment of the United States Africa Command. The first major reason that they gave in the past 20 years was that there's a war on terror, and in order to fight the war on terror, the United States need to ally itself with so-called partners for the war on terror. And this unleashed tremendous hardships in Africa in the militarization of relations in Somalia and in West Africa, especially with the Trans-Sahara counter-terror initiatives and the fallout. The second reason that was given after the Obama administration came to power was that the United States said that they were supporting defense development and democracy. That was the Obama administration. The Obama administration that called the first US African Leaders Summit said we were no longer fighting terrorism because terrorism is not a tactic. But it was the same Obama administration that supported Goldman Sachs and Wall Street in destroying Libya. So what we see is that there's a silence in the destruction of African societies that want alternatives. And I want to stress this point because I wrote a book that many of you have had access to in South Africa, Global NATO and the Catastrophic Failure in Libya, Lessons for Africa in the forging of African unity. We won't go over that here, but this United States strategic doctrine does not mention what Professor Maniai talked about, the need for infrastructure development and reconstruction, that African leaders who go to Washington should be focused on. There should be reconstruction. After Obama administration, the fourth reason for the US Africa Command was that the Trump administration, or the Trump regime, which was the most explicit in its racism against Africans, talked about Prosper Africa and said that no longer will the United States military be confronting with terrorism, but it will be to fight China and Russia in Africa. Now, this is disrespect for Africa. And the Biden administration has doubled down on this because they've gone forward with the legislation that has been talked about in the report, countering
there. It's to counter malign activities. I think that's what you're looking for.
activities.
Yes.
So here we have two pieces of legislation. The Global Fragility Act passed in Congress in 2019 and the malign Russia activities. Now, there's a war going on in Ukraine. Africans are opposed to this war, but the United States is telling Africans that you should not have independent decisions about your relations with Russia and China. And by the way, the same United States that has passed sanctions against Russia, a report came out yesterday that the United States has increased its trade with Russia by giving waivers to company to import fertilizer from Russia. So we see the United States policy towards Africa as a continuation of the militarization of Africa, insulting Africans, and it misses out important points that should be stressed by Africans if they go to Washington, because many countries in Africa should adopt the position that Latin American countries took when the US called a Latin American summit. They said, if Cuba, Venezuela is not going to be there, we will not be there. Now, if you go, then you should raise important issues. Let me raise 3 issues that should be discussed in Washington if Africans go there. The first, apart from the questions of reconstruction, as Professor Maniai talked about, that there should be investment for African reconstruction. The second and most important is that in terms of trade between Africa and the rest of the world, Africans should not be bullied about who they can trade with. Africans have clear objectives and aspirations in the African Union and the African Continental Free Trade Act. The United States of America is not a major trading partner with Africa because they have spent so much time on military spending that the United States is actually 5th on the list when it comes to trade with Africa, after the European Union, China, India, Japan, and even countries like the Emirates and Saudi Arabia are way ahead of the United States. And I think one of the things that was missing in the report is the prolonged negotiations before the Ministry of Trade and Industry in South Africa over the Africa Growth and Opportunity Act. That when Rob Davis was the Minister of Trade and Industry in South Africa, there was prolonged discussion over the bullying of South Africa about South African wine and South African poultry getting into the United States of America. And the United States twisted the arm And they, of course, made room for South African wine, but not for, and so that Africans had to import chicken. Now, that discussion is very important in the relations between the United States and Africa, because the United States of Africa is not offering new possibilities for trade in new areas with Africa. That is one. I want to mention another, which the report from the Institute of Global Dialogue mentioned, but did not go into enough details on. This is the question of the United States Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act and the trillions of dollars that are being expended by the United States of America to protect its industry and for what they call climate change. So here it is. The United States, through the IMF and the World Bank, dictates to Africa that they should not spend money that they do not have. But the United States is printing dollars to the extent of probably $4 trillion for this Inflation Reduction Act. Now, the Europeans, and the report dealt with this, where the Europeans, the Germans, and the French said to the United States of America, you are protecting your industry against us. And the report did not get this, but last week when President Macron visited the White House, they said, we will tweak the report so that it doesn't exclude you. There's another instance that is in the report that is worth elaborating on, apart from the USA Inflation Reduction Act. That is the Australia, UK, United States submarine agreement for confrontation with China. When the United States excluded France from this AUK-US agreement about nuclear submarine, Macron was very angry to the point of withdrawing its ambassador from Washington, D.C. This is in the report, but we need to spell that out here. In response to the anger of Macron and the French, the United States said to France, okay, we know you're angry about this, but what we will do, we will give you carte blanche for your activities in Africa, and we'll support you where you do not have the capabilities for transportation, satellite, drones, etc. We will support you in this so-called war on terror. So the United States of America is now strengthening the capabilities of France for its new colonial military relations in Africa at the point where the people of Africa in Mali, all of West Africa, are calling for the removal of France, the removal of French troops, and the removal of the French currency. And this is very important for Africa because we see next door to South Africa in Mozambique. What is not spoken about is the role of France in the insecurity that's going on in Mozambique because of the oil and gas in the Indian Ocean. And we need to speak about that. And we need to speak about the fact that the United States is complicit with the colonial relations of France in Comoros and in Diego Garcia with the British. The last point I want to make is linked to these points. If the United States say, do what we say and don't do what we do, that is, you cannot develop industries to protect Africa for the unification and freedom of Africa. And the IMF will come in and dictate to you. And the United States will go to Africans and say, well, we're going to develop space technology and we're going to go to the moon. And our military challenge in going to the moon is to get scientists on our side to go to the moon so we can carry out cyber warfare against China. So the United States called a meeting with Africa Space Leadership Institute. And African Space Leadership Institute said to the United States, but in Africa, we need space resources so that we can have better technology in Africa, we can have better communications with Africa, we can have a digital future in Africa. But the United States say, we're not interested in what your needs are. We want our needs to be taken care of. So these questions about the United States on trade and the continued militarization of Africa should be drilled down in greater depth. The last point I want to make is that the report, I was very, I was not too enthused about the effusive praise it had for African-American congressional leaders and the relations between African-Americans and Africans. What we should do in the intellectual community, in the foreign policy community, is distinguish between those African leaders in the United States who support the objectives of Africa and those who are opposed to it. For example, the current head of the House Foreign Relations Committee, Greg Meeks, was very responsible for the Global Fragility Act, where Congress will provide $1.15 billion for peace-building efforts in Haiti, Libya, Mozambique. Now, here it is, the United States goes to destroy Libya and comes before Congress and talking about the Global Fragility Act. I hope that the Institute of Global Dialogue will have a major conference on Libya and on the restoration of peace and reconstruction in Libya. And the last point, the very last point, is about reparations and reparative justice. Professor Moniai discussed reparations and reparative justice in relation to the Global Africa, the Caribbean reparations platform, and the developments in Haiti. And I was very pleased to hear him say this, because the United States is seeking to mobilize opinions so that they could invade Haiti again in face of their reversals in Colombia, Venezuela, Chile, and Brazil. The Global African Platform of Solidarity is very important, so that reparations is not only about money. Reparations is about saying crimes were committed. And so in South Africa, in Africa, Global Africa were very pleased of the solidarity in the face of the George Floyd killing. Now, there was an International Commission of Inquiry into Police Violence in the United States of America. The report should highlight this, because the Permanent Forum of the United Nations is a permanent forum of African descendants that is now meeting in Geneva under the auspices of the United Nations Human Rights Commission. And that permanent forum is a permanent forum to raise the question of racism, discrimination, violence, and reparative justice. And we in the community of scholars who have solidarity from the period of apartheid to now should be meticulous about the language we use when we discuss United States relations with Africa. We cannot repeat what they say about democracy. If they have democracy, they cannot bring Sisi of Egypt or Museveni of Uganda or Kagame to Washington. If they're concerned about these things about viruses, they cannot carry out vaccine apartheid against Africa. And we need the kind of solidarity we saw with the treatment action campaign in South Africa, when those who needed access to retroviral drugs mobilized politically so that South Africa, India, and Brazil developed drug therapies. And we need the same kind of activism. But we need that activism to be informed about African requirements for reconstruction, reparative justice, and peace. And that's why I will end by going back to what should be on the agenda. We should call for the dismantling of the United States Africa Command, or for the removal of French military troops in Africa.
Prof. Campbell, for that opening salvo. It's interesting you're talking about the AFRICOM, right? Because June this year, as you're also aware, we saw the outgoing commander, General Townsend, saying that essentially the NATO strategic document reframing Africa as its southern flank. Africa in the North MENA region, and particularly Africa as the southern flank in the Mediterranean, which I think really touches on also your earlier point about the militarization, the presence of what we've seen as the permanent bases and the lily pads across Africa, also touch on the militarization aspect. And if I can sum up what the core of your messaging is that we shouldn't be swayed by sort of the new messaging. In looking deeper at the strategy, it's essentially new wine in old wineskins, to put it bluntly. And I think many in the audience maybe would have a couple of things to say in response to that. Sanusha, I want to come to you also to give you a chance, and then I'll turn to the panelists here with me. So for you, I think the question that I would like for you to address is speak to the economic and trade related aspects of US-Africa relations. Prof Campbell briefly alluded to questions about the future of AGOA post 2025. And I think it's interesting when we also look at recent developments, the operationalization of the African Continental Free Trade Area raises interesting questions, particularly about the implications of Africa's bargaining power. And why I bring up the AFCFTA is because we know also about there's been in the background talks between Kenya and the US for a bilateral FTA deal modeled along the Morocco one, right? So this brings up the question about a potentially divide and rule logic pertinent to the trade agreement, what that would mean. Would it diminish Africa's bargaining power to a large degree? And also it raises question about whether AGOA, yes, it's been necessary, but it's largely proven insufficient to a large degree. And when we look at recent I'd say broader developments in the global politics and global economic developments, particularly the meteoric rise of China, right? And the place that it occupies in terms of Africa's trade relation, the share that it's captured, just the sheer volume of export, as export volumes capturing up to 11%. Meanwhile, on the other hand, US-Africa trade in terms of export has declined sharply. It only captures about, I'd say, 5% of export share. So in light of that sort of context, please comment on the trade and economic aspects of the dimension of the relationship and where you see this going forward. Would AGOA be suspended, for instance? If you can just gaze into the crystal ball for us. Thank you, Sanusha. Please go ahead.
Good day, Faith. Thank you very much. It's always a pleasure to be on the panel. It's good to see Prof. Campbell, who I haven't seen him in quite a long time during my Fahamu days. And it's always fantastic to know that he hasn't changed his trajectory of what he's been speaking about. Thank you to Pranani, thank you to the colleagues at IGD and putting together, I think, as Prof said, a very timely discussion. And I think the challenge is really picking up from where Prof. Campbell has raised the question of how do we disaggregate the economic interest from the militarization or the securitization of the economic interests that countries like the US have in Africa, and to try and find that hook in terms of what has been the ebb and flow of US's global political economy in terms of how it shapes the international global architecture around the geo-economic interests. But I think when it comes to Africa, the challenges are really around this dynamic you raised, Faith, and that is the question around where are we going with regard to AGOA? Where are we going with regard to how does AGOA fit within the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? But I think we've got to layer this approach, and we've got to layer it in a way that we have to look at it in terms of what do countries do from a bilateral perspective? How does that then get ventilated at the regional level in terms of regional economic communities and the kind of economic trade engagements that we see, whether it's the Southern African Development Corporation, whether we community rather, sorry, or we see it in EAC, whether we see it in COMESA, or we see it in the context of ECOWAS, and then other so-called economic communities and arrangements. And then how does this then get ventilated or manifest in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement? one of the things that I think that needs to be looked at, and I was hoping it would be ventilated a little bit more in the report, was the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and how does it find its nuance in terms of what the African continent is talking about, leaders, countries, business, corporates, civil society, etc., in how this Continental Free Trade Agreement is going to create that kind of synergy that Palani and David spoke about earlier around the regional economic arrangement. The borders are porous. In fact, the borders are actually not just porous, they're frivolous in many ways in Africa. And the challenge we have with the Continental Free Trade Agreement, in my opinion, and I'm reading it just based on my own interpretation, is that there needs to be a little bit more understanding of what a bilateral trade agreement, like in the case of the US-Kenyan one that's modeled on the US-Moroccan arrangement, would actually impact on the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. Is there a room for flexibility for countries thinking that third-party arrangements and third-party engagements, whether it's the US, whether it's China, whether it's India, when we have a bilateral investment treaty with these countries or a trade relationship or a treaty with these countries, does it then supersede the African Continental Agreement? And I think this is where the deposit of instruments in terms of adopting the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, whether at the bilateral and how does it then the rules of origin apply to the regional economic, is really a question of legality and frameworks. What are your instruments within the ACFTA that gives you a sense to say we can start with these value chains, we can move? And I think this is where the AGOA becomes much more of an interesting dynamic. I'm not sure whether we can say that it's going to go away. I think it's going to be, you spoke about new wine in old skins. I think AGOA is going to basically be about the re-securitization of the trade with Africa. And I think that for me is critical in the context of what we're talking about, because it allows you to also think about how will it impact on trade negotiations, whether it's the point that Prof made about the wine access and then, of course, buying of poultry. But it also raises the question of whether legislation in countries, like the US is pushing legislation, which is critical to how it sees its relationship in Africa and how it defines that relationship in Africa around the Global Fragility Act, and of course the misalignment and the act, and trying to push countries not to do not to have relations with particular countries, and the sanctions in terms of how that becomes a key factor and a critical factor in your trade relationship. I think AGOA is also in that very gray area and gray corridor in terms of how it's going to protect the corporate economic interests of American companies. But more importantly, if it's seen that you want to actually create competition in the market, which David touched on, but competition that actually hurts American companies. So we do know that in South Africa, and I don't know where it is in the context of legislation, but when South Africa was trying to regulate the private security market and industry in terms of the number of private security providers that were coming into the market and trying to regulate that, it became a key issue as well between US negotiations and the South African government, because it doesn't work in their interest. And I think when you start to filter this out and span it out in terms of the economic interest that you have, you're then going to start looking at the other areas that are going to become critical to AGOA. So I think the first point is really that uncertainty, that corridor of uncertainty between what we're trying to achieve, and what David rightly pointed out is what does Africa want in terms of the economic trade dimension, not just with the US, but with all of its external partners. And infrastructure development is key. Creating logistics and ports and access in terms of movement of goods and services is key. But it's also key to understand that infrastructure development comes with serious questions about how you actually go about with your tendering process, who gets the access, who brings in the infrastructure. And I think in the case of China, we're seeing a maturing of that trade in terms of where China is. Yes, China is still very much a key actor in terms of Africa's trade partners, and in the whole context of the hierarchy and looking at the top 5 trade partners that Africa has. But when it comes to the investment side, I think you're seeing a shift as well. And David spoke about the debt question and how the debt is being used as a way to also try and offset. So it's not just legislation around whether or not you can, the chip market and so forth, but it's also the question of debt and how debt is being used as an instrument around the economic dimensions of the US's engagement with Africa. And of course, the question then becomes the control of the raw materials that tie in to the chip market, into your technological productions, etc., in terms of your smartphones, etc. I didn't know this, and I stand corrected on this, but I think the largest market in terms of popular phones in Africa is a smartphone brand that doesn't get all the headline news, and it's a Chinese brand, but it's affordable. It gives you all these apps, and it actually comes into the African market because it's a much more affordable brand. And we're seeing a lot of these Chinese phones coming into the South African market that are not your iPhones or your Huawei's, which is the broader end, or your Samsungs of the spectrum. But it's those kinds of products I think are going to be impacted by these kinds of questions that we look at in terms of the political economy and the securitization of trade as we move forward. The second point I want to make is really the question around understanding how this will play out in terms of projects or in terms of licensing in the technological space. For example, with the US providing some of the financing for telecommunication, the building of the underwater sea cables, the optic fiber cables, the data questions, and David Center did a very interesting project on data sovereignty. Where is your cloud computing happening? Where are these data centers in terms of who is actually controlling your data services, but how also controlling your data in terms of where it is being stored is the new question within this economic dimension. So you've got your normal trade, which we think about in terms of goods and services, but you're also now entering into the technological space around data and data sovereignty, but also in terms of companies that are beginning to move into 5G. And this is becoming a serious political economy question as well within the space of the relationship that the US and Africa will have. It ties in very nicely with what Prof. Campbell was saying, in terms of, data is not just about whether you have access to data and you have a phone that is doing all fancy things and you basically storing your storage here and your personal data there. It's who actually controls the data, that actually the data centers. And this is going to be a big key issue in terms of where we are moving and whether that becomes part of the way in which the US, together with other countries, are start negotiating the companies and the access under the question around the alignment to the trade dimensions of what we're seeing as the securitization of trade in the context of AGOA, which is, I think, is critical. We're not paying enough attention to it. We should be thinking about this because it makes us very vulnerable. And I think governments in Africa, as well as the South African government, have suddenly woken up to the idea of vulnerability when it comes to these kinds of issues and how that plays out with the big corporates and big tech and so forth. Linked to this is the question really around how the US may actually pressurize countries in the context of licensing of what you call this mobile technology, infrastructure, and so forth, where the US has now provided finance, but who makes the consortium? They have to conform to certain standards and codes. And let me give you an example. The Ethiopian licensing for the mobile license that was issued not so long ago, I think it was last year, where you had two consortiums. You had the US-led consortium with the IFC finance, and that included, I think, Vodafone, and it included one other company, I think it was Ericsson or another European company. And the other consortium was led by China, was through the Silk Road Fund of China, but it was actually by a Chinese company, I think it was Huawei. And of course, it included a South African partner, and that was MTN. Now, the question is, according to the awarding of the license, it was the US-backed consortium that came the closest or even got to the actual amount that the Ethiopian telecoms was asking for in terms of the tender. But then, of course, there's a subtext to this, and that is all part of the pushback. It's all part of how you are capturing the markets in Africa, the new markets, which are much more tied in to your security architecture. So if it's about technological drones and militarization in the context of hardware, we're now dealing with another element of securitization in the context of artificial intelligence. We're dealing with AI, with automation. We're dealing with data, the infringement of personal data, the question of cloud storage. I mean, this is just really things that we should be putting on the agenda for our leaders to be talking about and asking the question in terms of what is the trade dimension? It's no longer the kind of only the traditional trade dimensions of market access. How much of market access does Africa have to the US market under AGOA? Or how much of market access does the US companies have to African markets under AGOA? I think AGOA is evolving, and its iteration is changing very rapidly. And if we're talking about value chains, then we've got to be careful in assuming that value change is only within a particular construct. The other point I want to make here, and I'll try and bring my comments to a conclusion, is the challenge I think we have is when we think about what is Africa's value proposition when it comes to trade. We look at it very much in a reductionist and a binary way. We look at it as if it has to be about industrialization only, and it has to be about how we bring that investment into industrialization. The point I want to make is that there's a serious governance deficit when it comes to the WTO, the World Trade Organization. When it comes to the question of the vaccine issue, in terms of the fact that whilst the language was very complimentary and very, very diplomatic in welcoming South Africa and India to ask for the temporary waiver in terms of IP, the intellectual property rights in terms of the vaccine production. Behind the scenes, the other diplomatic issues were not being discussed. That is, there was pressure, there was lobby that South Africa and India would get a watered down text at the WTO. And this is a reality about trade. Trade in the context of where we are in terms of intellectual property rights, in terms of the diplomacy that happens in the corridors and outside, the lobbying that takes place, and the fact that you also have to think about what are we trying to bring into Africa in terms of the value chain. So the question I would be very careful in thinking about, which I think this report lays out a very important architecture that we need to think about. But I think there's a second report here to follow up in terms of the points raised about where we're going with this kind of political economy questions that are being raised about why the US is so aggressive, if that's the right term to use, about the pushback, about the legislative dynamics that are being passed in the US. And the last point, I think, for me, very critically, is to disaggregate the US itself. Which US are we talking about? If we're talking about the authority, we're talking about the state, that's a very important dynamic to be clear about. If you're talking about corporate actors, we've got to understand their role and their agency as well. But we also have a social activism in the US, which I think is critical to understand how it ties in back to that revitalization of the global solidarity, which I think Prof very eloquently laid out for us. But more importantly, I think the challenge we also have is the US soft power, which we see on our TV screens constantly. The buying in of the US project in our continent, and the leaders that kind of want to emulate that, but the language and the fact that we are able to see that the US has a serious dilemma in its social justice project. But unfortunately, we're not challenging that in the context of how we need to activate what we see as things that are becoming almost this kind of a global culture where the pushback is not just about the geopolitics. The pushback is also the use of soft power and cultural power and structural power. And those are dynamics that we need to be very clear on, because what scares me the most, and I talk about this in the context from the South African perspective, is how much our society in South Africa wants to emulate the US. in all of its actions and behavior. And those behaviors become very critical to the fact that we have to be careful, that this is not the example to follow, if I can be as bold as that there are inherent challenges to what we are seeing in the context of our media, in the context of our TV screens, in the context of even how we define the narrative about the world based on what we are syndicating as the narrative, which we are basically importing from the outside world. So we had this discussion 2 weeks ago, Palani and Faith, for those that didn't attend, where we had looked at the role of media in South African foreign policy. Why do we pay so much of attention on particular conflicts and not look at the conflict that's so near us in Mozambique, or to give the conflict attention that's happening in Tigray and so forth. And I think this is something that we have to think about in terms of the disaggregated effect about that the US is not homogenous, but which US are we talking about and how powerful that US is. So let me stop there, Faith, and then I think we can go further with the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Sanusha. Really appreciate the comments, and I think you've covered quite a broad ground, touching on the economic aspects, but as well how that interlinks with the broader geopolitical climate. I know we need to turn to questions, but I felt that it would be remiss for me not to ask this, considering that we have Prof. Munyai and you're the director of the Africa China. It would be remiss for me not to ask you this. So complementary to the US Africa strategy, right, that was released in August of this year. For those of you who might not be aware, so the US government also updated its national security strategy in October of this year. And it's interesting when you look at the NSS document, right? It mentions Russia 71 times. It mentions China 55 times. I think that's when I do a search on that, that what comes up. And I think that's quite telling, Prof. Munyai, because in your earlier remarks, right, you mentioned about how, yes, the relationship with China is about infrastructure development, etc. But it also has this dimension where we see the nurturing of people-to-people ties. It also sort of builds on the kind of perceptions that Sino-African relations have been centered with, particularly when you look at attendance at FOCAC summits, right? The kind of hype that's generated around FOCAC, and also perceptions among African leaders themselves, that FOCAC accords them an opportunity or views them almost on a basis of mutual respect, partnership of equals, etc. And this is something that some have argued is very hard to find on the US side, this notion of being lectured that Pilani mentioned. So my question to you is, when you look at recent developments as far as US-Africa relations are concerned, an example in this case would be, for instance, how long it took in previous years to the appointment of the Undersecretary for African Affairs at the State Department. It took a while before they got senatorial approval. Even in South Africa, closer home, the vacancy at the US Embassy for the ambassador actually took a while. And this is obviously linked to policy developments and the kind of bureaucratic machine that the US operates. In terms that's partly another issue. But this, I'd say implicitly, gives across the message that Africa has not been a priority to a large degree. In fact, disengagement has shown that there's been a waning of attention, right, from the US side. So my question for you, Prof. Munyai, would be, in light of these developments and also what we see happening at the BRICS Plus, the beeline forming to join BRICS, the 10th G20 summit, almost a signaling or a death knell for the American empire, right? So in light of this development, do you think that the US is failing to recognize this very key historical process, the emergence of a so-called multipolar order, whether you want to say that that's led by a Russia-China alliance or the global South, that's debatable. But the question is the US failing to realize the truth and the reality on the ground that the sun does indeed rise in the east and sets in the west?
That's a difficult question, tough one. I think, let me start from the basics. I do not think that South Africa or the entire African continent wants to unseat United States as the most hegemonic power in the world. I don't think that's the intention of Africans. Their intentions are very simple. We want the continent to be a pillar in itself. So before we go to Beijing or any other place. So first and foremost, the continent itself to become a pillar. And therefore the reform within the United Nations Security Council and all important agencies are uppermost. We are largely informed by the 1955 Bandung Conference. I mean, there's nothing difficult for us to understand that. I think for Washington to understand as well. Number two is that we are an important player and we need to be seen as such. And therefore, this issue being preached at, which is becoming quite disturbing, is that democracy is growing on the African continent. So the idea in Washington or in Europe to think that democracy resides in Washington or in Europe, it's not shared on the African continent. I mean, democracy is also residing on the African continent. And there are concerns about democracy in those terrains in America itself and in Europe. And therefore then come as a preacher, understanding democracy. There are a lot of contradictions, and it's well and good. We support and we have pro-democracy, but the manner in which you weaponize the narrative of democracy for other agendas, I think that's where we take different ways and differ, particularly if democracy is used to deal with another partner. US and China, whatever issues that they have to be sorted between those two partners. Has absolutely nothing to do with the continent, and therefore to assert Africa's agency, position on these things. However, we also say, given Africa's position within global economy, these tensions has negative impact. Let's look at the South China Sea. Our economy across the entire continent is depending on Asia, of course, led mainly China, but Asia is growing fast. I mean, the future, the current global economy, it's Asia. And therefore, if there are any disturbances in those trading routes, it has a direct impact on us. And therefore, I don't think we respond to those issues in favoring one. So I think it's also important we don't take sides. We don't, neither Washington nor Beijing. I think that's the position that is a right position to take for the African continent. But when it comes to direct US perception of the continent and the treatment of Africans, we know the names that we have been called by Donald Trump. Even his wife, when he visited Safari, in Kenya, she came wearing this colonial dress and symbols. I really do not think it's the understanding in some quarters in the developed world, the sensitivity, not just on issues of slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, the impact it has on the African psyche and how Africa responds to some of these issues. The lack of respect that even President Biden, up to now, I mean, there hasn't been any attempt to take Africa that serious in terms of visits. So when you talk of partnership and strategic partnership, we do see how we are treated and how you are referred to in speeches that Africa is constantly mentioned, but in reality, you see that Africa is not that important, other than as a launching pad for a much more bigger US hegemonic agenda. So that's worrying for us. Lastly, I think for me, we also look at the concerns, our neighboring Zambia having an AFRICOM troops. I mean, it's a no-no for SADC and for the AU itself. In any way, the existence of foreign troops on the African, regardless of who, it's a no-no for the continent. I think there's a need to respect that. That does not mean that Africa does not want to enter into security arrangements to deal with global issues of terrorism, issues of security, peacekeeping, the assistance in terms of peacekeeping and conflict resolution on the African continent. Those are critical. However, that should not be done in a way of dominance and advancing a particular agenda. One area that is of uppermost important is it came in through the Zondo Commission in South Africa. A number of American companies were involved in dubious activities, corruption. And that does not come quite heavily when a message comes from Washington. I think these African leaders need to mention there is a need for United States, as much as it points fingers of companies of other countries, that it needs to look into its own companies and how they are playing, working on the African continent, because that in itself, particularly when it comes to illicit flow of funds, Africa is losing more resources, more than what Africa is receiving. And the bulk of those companies are American companies. I think President Biden could play a critical role alongside African leaders in bringing to book a number of companies that are playing negative role in our development, and redirect those resources. So the anti-corruption move for the US is welcome, but it has to be done evenly, not selectively, as the case at the moment. We need to see more and more of that. I cannot to emphasize more on the question of Sanusha, and thank you for bringing in. There's a study that we did at the Center for Africa-China Studies, looking at the data sovereignty, that the US companies are dominating when it comes to digital. So I think the core players at a global level at the moment are US and Chinese companies. But we have seen when it comes to Africa, our entire data is controlled in California. And therefore, there's a worry of neo-colonialism. I mean, there's no any form that is more dangerous than their entire life kept by someone else in other territories other than yours. And therefore, Europe, we've seen Europe trying to defend itself, bringing into books whether our own South African-born Elon Musk in Europe, putting laws that governs. So at a global level, we don't have, when it comes to digital laws, it's a wild west. And therefore, there is a need for African leaders to raise this issue, to regulate these companies, and for Africa also to keep its data in Africa. So all companies that come to Africa, they should not keep our data so that we have to buy this very same data. It also comes with a number of things of taking Africa's own intellectual property, whether it's rooibos, I think you know a number of issues. I mean, these all sorts of things that Africa need to be quite careful as it enters into the future and how it reaches out to strategic partners. On what terms do they come and invest? And these are critical issues that any sensible African leader should be worried about than these short-termist visits to Washington. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Munya. And I think you've sort of brought us back into one of the key messaging that I think the summit needs to address. The question of whether, or the risk that Washington will find itself in if it continues to be ensnared by this narrative that depicts Africa as a geopolitical proving ground. If that continues, then you're going to find it's going to be very difficult for them to effectively apply the notion of smart power. So using hard power and soft power in a complementary manner. Pilani, I don't know if you had any other comments? I know you wanted to defer some of your time, but if you have maybe final remarks, and then I can open up for questions.
No, I think maybe we just take a round and yeah, then we take it from there.
So I'll open up, I'll give priority to the audience members on the floor, and then maybe open up to 1 or 2 questions from the online audience. So please, by show of hands, if you have questions directed at the panelists, this is your opportunity. So I recognize 1, 2, 3. I can't take too many. So the first hand that I saw is the lady in the flowery dress. So 1, the lady in the orange dress behind there, 2. And then on this side, Aditi, I see you, and the gentleman next to you. I'll come back for a second round. So please, and also to the audience, I know we are slightly over time, but if you, I'll request your indulgence in just extending for a few minutes, and then we'll wrap up. Yeah. So yeah.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Ambassador Carmen Schmidt, not currently deployed, but in the ANC IR. But there's a couple of 3 quick points. Number 1, is everything not by design? Because being the richest continent, but being the poorest, and the continual influx of loans, and if you look at the currency system on how it keeps us behind, it's one of the issues that I think that we don't look at deep enough. Multinationalism is a challenge. There's nothing governing it, and it finds itself on the continent because we separate politics and economics. We speak of it in different discussions, but it's all one. And any country with political power and no economic power finds itself in the position that our countries find themselves in the African continent. This new issue around the IMF loans, how is anybody looking at how is it going to really impact on the AU 2063 agenda? Because without industrialization, I don't see us moving forward and owning our own goods. Then this other issue that really bothers me lastly is we all call for foreign investment. What does it do for us, actually? It actually makes us poorer and poorer and poorer. When do we turn what we have within the continent? Or how do we turn what we have within the continent, like in Asia, like in the other countries, to actually benefit us? Thank you.
I'd request that you keep your comments very brief. I will cut you off from now on if you tend to venture into a speech. Please.
Hi, thanks everyone. My name's Lerato. I've got a comment and a question. I've read this strategy document and I did so last night and then I refreshed this morning. I think it's a very poor policy document overall. You know, the document in its entirety is 16 pages. And I note that your critique of it is longer than the policy document itself. And for an entire continental overview, I'm worried that it's deeply lacking on granular details about targets, about what it's going to attain, and more importantly, how it's going to go about doing it. The second critique I have about it is that there's no focus on regional dynamics at all. The document is very generic. It seems and reads as though it's a consolidation of briefing notes, thematically especially. There's a lot of repetition, AGOA, we've got PEPFAR, you've got Power Africa. There's a lack of substantive novelty in what its offering is, and as opposed to what it's countering, which is Russia and China. I felt that that was a huge wasted opportunity for Senator Blinken and the rest of the team there. Secondly, Sanusha, you've hit the nail on the head when you're talking about industry and development in Africa. I'm worried as well that we're not paying enough attention to the AFCFTA as a continent, and we are losing momentum and sight over what it is we need to be achieving right now. As a continent, let alone as a region, we do not have a consolidated industrial policy, and especially in relation to infrastructure development. We can't really start talking about value chains, as, sorry, Pilani, you spoke about that earlier post-COVID, because I'm afraid we don't have industry. And we don't have industry for issues for such as load shedding, because this is strategically deindustrializing the South African economy. And that's a massive problem for the biggest economy in Africa. I just wanted to ask all of you, maybe Sinisha, you can start, how are we going to bring AFTA to the forefront of our own agenda as a continent? Go ahead.
Thanks a lot. Just to commend the team for the work they're doing, very brilliant work. 2 quick questions related to the last speaker. Number one, if you've read the Africa policy under Trump and under Biden, are there any specific changes of note that what has changed of significance that you may want to highlight? Secondly, my question to Prof, the director of the Africa-China Center for Africa-China Studies, is do we have an ongoing African conversation on partnerships? So outside of FOCAC, EU-Africa Strategic Partnership, EU-USA, is there a space on the African continent where there's an engagement on what partnerships should mean for Africa, and specifically towards the setting of an African foreign policy agenda? And the background of this question is, I've looked at your report, is absolutely brilliant. I was telling the director during the break that I wish there was an institutional home to hold this and run with it. So is it ad hoc, or is there someone that owns the agenda? And my final question has to do with your appreciation of African interest in a divided US context. I sort of picked up that in your comments and thoughts, especially the comments toward the Trump administration. So I would like to get your view. Have you taken a position that says you have to deal with the US, taking into account the fact that you're dealing with the Biden administration? Do you take for granted that the Trump administration and its policies were naturally hostile to Africa? Is there any study that has established that, or do we take it for granted? I sort of picked that up a lot in the comments that you have made in the report. And then final quick comment, the summary really...
I think you've asked 3 questions. So Aditi, please.
Sorry, I feel bad about that. My name is Aditi Lal Bahadur. I work with a humanitarian organization, advocacy organization called Crisis Action. So I'm going to flip the conversation a little bit, unfortunately, from this sort of very sort of economics and development focus to actually something that's specifically on humanitarianism. And for me specifically, I'm now leading a global campaign on the Central Sahel. And the observations really around that and how quickly that is deteriorating for me is quite worrying. You know, with the continuous drawing down of MINUSMA troops in Mali, you know, the announcement recently by Burkina Faso authorities of arming civilians, 40,000 civilians, that directly put them in line with, you know, in the firing line against jihadis, insurgents. So I think that what my observation in working on this particular conflict is really that there's a rising anti-Western sentiment that's sort of quite pervasive, particularly in that region. And I'm speaking specifically about that region because that's where I have expertise on. And yet there's this, you know, this sort of very urgent need to address a very urgent security threat. So inspired by a lot of the conversation around how Africa can be more proactive, how Africa can be sort of set the agenda on things. My question to the panel, and actually to anybody who has any sort of thing on this, you know, sort of opinion on this, really is just, what should Africa be speaking to the US about on this particular issue? And how should the US be engaging? How should we be engaging the US specifically on the Central Sahel? Specifically, as you're saying, it's a militarized approach, and yet I'm not seeing much militarization from the US, particularly on this issue.
Give the panelists time to answer, but Kenny, may I request you to please pick 2 questions from the online audience, which we'll take after this, so that they also are also included in the. No, I also want to give the online audience a chance, please. Meanwhile, while you please pick 2 pertinent ones, the ones that are not already repeating some of the questions, please. And here I'll rely on your discretion. So I'll give first chance to Prof. Campbell. You can address any of the questions that were raised, which you think you'd be best placed to answer briefly, and then Sanusha, you'll go after, and then I'll give, because there's some questions for Prof. Manyai lastly. Prof. Campbell, please.
Well, I think that the last question about humanitarianism is something that we should interrogate, because there can be no peace in West Africa, in the Sahel, without peace in Libya. And with the reconstruction of Libya and demilitarization of Libya, this would have an impact on the Sahel region. I am afraid that what is called humanitarianism is a backdoor for the perpetuation of France in the West Africa region. Clearly, there is a serious situation in West Africa, but demilitarization would require, first and foremost, the removal of French troops and French military involvement in West Africa. And I would add British military involvement, because we now saw recent developments of Britain deploying troops to Ghana because the French being removed. I think this is where the capabilities of the African Union will need to come in. We have seen the role of the African Union in the negotiations between Ethiopia and the Tigrayan forces, and we need to deploy African resources at the diplomatic, political, and military level in West Africa. We need to do that more vigorously in the case of the Congo. I want to add to one other point about the developments in the Congo. We cannot speak about United States and Africa without speaking about demilitarization of the Congo. And we hope that South Africa would be more engaged with East Africa in the demilitarization of the Congo, because clearly Kenya now has communications, technology, trade, and transportation interest in the Congo, as Congo is a member of the East African Community. But South Africa should not be aloof from the demilitarization of the Congo, because it is said that Elon Musk, who is a South African, is involved in this region, and they want to see development of electric vehicles. It is in the, factories that can produce electric batteries. And in this region, Tanzania, Kenya, the Congo have an interest in peace in the Congo. And I think the South African intelligentsia and policymakers need to be much more engaged on the questions of the Congo than they have been so far.
Sanusha, I know there were particular questions at you, the question about the implication of the financialization of the global economy and the kind of straitjacket it puts on African economies, and then the question of how do we privilege African agency in light of what we've discussed today. I think I'm paraphrasing here on the 2 questions, and then I'll come to Prof. Manyai lastly. Thank you.
Thanks, Faith, and thanks to the audience for the question. And I think what we're really grappling with here is how do we interpret African agency? And as the ambassador was speaking and talking about things of financialization of the global architecture, I mean, we're beginning to see that being challenged. But I'm very careful to assume that it's a decoupling, because it's so intricate that we live in such an intricate, interdependent financial architecture. And Faith knows that one of my favorite authors is Susan Strange, about structural power and how you control structural power in terms of the international political economy. But I think that's also beginning to find that it's not as cohesive, and hence the points that Prof was making about why you need to reassert your authority in the kind of securitization of development, and why you need to push back on whether it's the Belt and Road Initiative or create the Australian, US, UK submarine issue and placate the French and so forth. And it kind of ties in with this point that I keep grappling with, and that is we cannot afford for Africa to keep outsourcing its economic policy making to the outside. The problem here is we've got to find what is it that we want, and David asked the question, and we need to find that. But I think there's some serious dilemmas here about the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in my opinion, in that, is it only technical, or is it really about the economic policy making of Africa in terms of how do we define what it is? You know, we've cut, copy, and pasted these narratives about industrialization and about value chains and about, look at the Asian countries and they have done so well. I think we've got to be careful in becoming overzealous about the models that we think are working. The challenge we have is that we've got to find ourselves in terms of what's going to make and front load the African Continental Free Trade Agreement move forward. Is you've got to find what is the continental public goods. And you've got to be able to find those public goods. And part of those public goods is to start off with what South Africa had in terms of its foreign policy dynamic in the early 90s. And that was three things: peace, stability, and development. Unfortunately, we are entering a process of a brittle world, an incomprehensive global system, a non-linear approach to the way we see things. And of course, we're entering into this whole question of, of anxiety in terms of the fact that these economic dynamics we're talking about that's going to help us to alleviate the poverty and pull us out of the underdevelopment, etc. These are models that are not working. And we have to be very careful. We can't keep having the same model and tinkering with it. So I think the challenge we're going to have here is, first and foremost, is not FDI is a problem. It's the way you actually approach FDI, in the way that you approach it in the context of what you want to achieve. I don't think the challenge here is any one of us is trying to dismiss the fact that we need money to move forward. The problem is, what do we actually think about getting ourselves out of a point that David made very, very eloquently in his remarks earlier on in the opening session, and that is, how do we actually move away from looking at it in a kind of blinkered approach? And I think for me personally, I also think we have to start having that other awkward conversation, and that is, how is humanitarian interventions being defined and for what purpose and intention? Because I think the challenge we also have is there's another aspect to this whole debate on the political, the economic, the developmental, and the so-called non-profit sector in terms of how these humanitarian initiatives are being designed in the context of where is the intervention going through. So I think we've got to find the fact that we've got to come back to Africa. African leaders have to have honest discussions about themselves before they go to the summit, whether it's in Phuket, whether it's Beijing, whether it's the EU, whether it's in Washington, whether it's in Japan or TICAD. You've got to have an honest discussion about what you want. And right now, I'm not sure, because I see a lot of handing over to other people about what you want and assuming that it'll just kind of naturally flow.
For Prof. Munyai, there were two questions, if I remember correctly, aimed at you. It was the question about what initiatives, particularly, I'd say in this case, the AU is leading in terms of coordinating its strategic partnership initiative. I know there was talk about having a policy on strategic partnership as part of the AU reform agenda. So that was the one question. And then the second one, if I remember correctly, is also the question about what key messages African leaders are going to ask and relay at the US Africa Summit in December. So those two, please.
Thank you. And I welcome Lerato's salvo. Yes, you're more than welcome to join us. I think I'll tie that with where is this document going? It's an open report. It will go, anyone is interested in it anyway. And yes, it's good to hear your former students saying your document is not strong enough. So I do welcome, but let's take the conversation, time allowing, further to develop it to a second level. A number of issues that are coming, or a suggestion has already been made that we need a second report. When it comes to African agents, I think it's the key issue. I think what lacks is precisely that, African agents. We tend to, what as Sanusha has mentioned it rightly, to give other people to determine in terms of what should be your policy. The lack of policy sovereignty, it lacks in a number of countries across the continent. And the lack of thinking in terms of how should Africa close ranks on key issues that it has comparative advantage in, whether it's raw material, Professor Campbell. If we know that the batteries is the future, it's in digital and battery are key issues, I really do not see policies, whether it's the SADC level or the AU, how then do we have, and there's no country that has more, or continent that has more of these minerals than Africa. We really do not see the Africans themselves closing ranks and say, here our material, we cannot just continuously have outsiders take raw material without beneficiations on the African continent. I mean, we've been speaking about this for years, for decades, and it's high time that the new leaders should start thinking seriously, because this has security dimension to it. And I think we need to link those issues. Then the other major issue is the security itself. You cannot expect other people to keep your peace. I mean, Africans have to really, the funding of peacekeepers at AU level, entire infrastructure. Africans, we can't keep on begging for resources, especially in key areas. What are those areas do we close that the Africans need to be in charge of? Security, issues of trade. You can't have the free trade area. You have donation from European Union to help you design a trade agreement that they are going to enter with you. And then they donate this kindness of bringing in experts to help you design your agreements. You don't have to be, you see the weaknesses in terms of how we structure these issues. One of the most important point that Sanusha touched on has to do with the US-Kenya agreement that you mentioned. I think what was key to it was that there is a clause within that agreement that Kenya should allow its companies or its data to be mined by American companies. That is contrary to Africa's position. So I think that's a challenge we have, that smaller African countries and I mean, the lack of thinking in certain quarters will undermine continental agreements or what we agree as we confront the outside world. For the sheer 5-year elections, leaders just sign anything that comes their way. So I think we are more concerned about. Similarly with the HH in Zambia, came in power, hardly 6 months in power, allows AFRICOM to come in. He's popular in in Washington and so many places, darling to IMF, World Bank, but the results on the ground, Zambia, I do not see any fundamental change from the previous government to the current in terms of economic development. I think the situation will be even worse. if we follow quite closely. Therefore, there's a need of a clear thinking that we need as we engage our strategic partners. Let's put our interests first. Let's unite. Let's protect smaller countries, and let's speak with one voice in negotiating with our strategic partners at all times. How are we studying these strategic partners? I always ask my students, if we receive 20 calls at a go, which one do we pick first from the strategic partner, and why? Which one do you pick first? I think we need to ask those questions because we can't just ship our leaders to headquarters, capitals in so many places, and in a haphazard way. We need to think, and therefore I think we need to study where our interests as Africans, which countries do these interests converge with? With China, yes, let's go with China in those areas. Where it converge with the United States, we really close to United States on those specific. But to think we're going to have this blanket way with partners, it's a wishful thinking. I think we need to be smarter and think and see how other regions are responding to this new emerging new Cold War. Asian leaders are coming with a position. They made it very clear that they're not going to take sides. Middle East with President Xi Jinping in Saudi Arabia, a clear message is coming out that even the Middle East has a pushback. They don't want to get involved in big giant fights. Latin America is the same story that has been mentioned already. And therefore Africa cannot be a playing ground for giants who fight their own wars at the expense of Africans. And therefore I think our leaders will be able to concentrate on areas that converge with the United States and ensure that the United States' role on the African continent is constructive and it's in line with Agenda 2063. In areas where those interests are not aligned to Agenda 2063, there's nothing wrong in airing those views quite clearly in Washington or on the African continent. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to bring the session to a close. I know there were a couple of questions online, but unfortunately we are pressed for time and we need to wrap the event up. In that spirit, I'd like to ask the audience maybe a round of applause for our panelists and the insights they've shared. From me personally, thank you, Prof. Campbell. Sanusha, thank you for your insights, generated a lot of food for thought. Thank you also, Dr. Mtembu, Prof. Munyai, for your comments. And we also ask that you continue our engagement and you can have further conversations at lunchtime. Thank you very much for coming as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, Faith, just one question.
Colleagues, one announcement. Those who parked at the hotel, please pick up a parking ticket just outside.